Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping straight into, well, a really intense situation, the 2022 Kazakhstan unrest. I think for many of us watching, the sheer speed of those events back then was, frankly, shocking. You had what started as, street protests over gas prices, pretty standard stuff maybe, but then it just exploded. Widespread riots, buildings seized, and then this claim of an attempted coup. It happened so fast.
It really did. And that speed is kind of central to the perspective we're examining today. Our mission here for this deep dive is really to unpack the specific interpretation offered by our source material. We need to be clear up front. This isn't your typical economic analysis. The viewpoint here is intensely geopolitical. The source frames the whole thing not as just internal anger boiling over, but as something planned, meticulously planned, externally driven, what they call a color revolution.
Okay, yeah, that term itself is loaded. A color revolution. Let's definitely unpack that framework. Because the source's main takeaway is pretty stark. They're essentially saying this was a coup attempt that failed. A political move, basically, designed to look like something else, but with all the hallmarks, they argue, of a color revolution. And they point the finger squarely at U.S. and Western deep state forces.
That's the core assertion, that the goal wasn't just about Kazakhstan, but about destabilizing the whole region, specifically aiming at its big neighbors, China and Russia. So not just some local flare-up, but a major geopolitical play.
Right. So not organic, but orchestrated. That's the argument we're digging into.
Exactly. So first things first, we need to understand how this source defines a color revolution. They describe it as, well, a political tool, a calculated one, used, they claim, by the U.S. and the West to interfere in developing nations. It involves manipulation, maybe even brainwashing, using local issues as a cover. And the end game, according to this view, to turn these countries into, and this is their phrase, perpetual cultural and economic colonies.
Okay, but let's be fair to the source material here. They do acknowledge the initial spark, right? The local anger wasn't fabricated. They mentioned the gas price hike, definitely, but also deeper things. The poverty gap, corruption, youth unemployment, inflation. Real issues.
Oh, absolutely. They don't dismiss those. Those are the kindling, as you said. That's what got people onto the streets initially. But the argument is about what happened next. The sheer speed, the coordination, the sort of military feel to the riots that followed. That, the source insists, points away from spontaneous anger towards something, well, something professional, external organization. And this is where they bring in their specific evidence.
Yeah, I was struck by some of the details they cite. They talk about specific intelligence, apparently, like trucks being used just to transport weapons to protesters, not supplies, weapons, and people in special uniforms being active in the riots. Coordinated uniforms, plus how quickly key places were seized. The airport in Almaty, government buildings, taken over very fast.
Right. And that leads to the next point about sophistication. The government shut down the internet nationwide. Usually that cripples protest movements. But here, the source claims the rioters kept communicating. They supposedly used specialized, secure, wireless social media tools. And the source explicitly links these tools to ones used previously in the Hong Kong unrest.
Wait, hang on. The source claims 25,000 armed rioters. In Almaty, that city's population is under 2 million. That number itself, 25,000 armed people appearing suddenly, implies a huge logistical effort. Does the source say who provided the uniforms or the communication tech? Or is it inference?
They don't name a specific supplier in the text we reviewed. It's more inference based on the scale and tactics. They attribute the organization to what they term foreign terrorist elements, mixed within that 25,000 figure. The sheer size for them is the proof of outside help, a proxy force, essentially. And they also point to the longer-term context, the presence of tens of thousands of NGOs in Kazakhstan over the years affiliated with the U.S. and the West. They specifically name-drop the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, which they label an arm of the deep state for regime change, and the Soros Foundation. That long-term presence, they argue, built the necessary groundwork, the networks inside the country.
And then the bombshell, really, that suggests internal help. The arrest of Karim Masimov. He wasn't just anyone. He was the former prime minister and head of the National Security Committee, arrested for treason. That piece of evidence, if their interpretation holds, points to someone on the inside facilitating this.
Exactly. For the source, that's the smoking gun for deep penetration, for internal-external collusion. The idea that this wasn't just outsiders pushing, but insiders pulling, all hidden behind the initial protests.
Okay, so if we accept the source's premise of coordination and collusion, then the question becomes why? What was the strategic goal? Let's shift gears to that strategic dimension. The source lays out a pretty clear framework for who gets targeted by these alleged color revolutions. They call it the 3 keys.
Yeah, it's a neat model for how they see geopolitical targeting working. Key number 1, geopolitical importance. The country has to be, strategically located, central to big power dynamics. Key number 2, great power status. The target nation needs to be one that could potentially challenge U.S. dominance. They specifically mention China and Russia here. And key number 3, resources. Pretty straightforward. The country needs to be rich in something valuable, often energy, oil, gas.
In Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
Well, it ticks all those boxes perfectly, according to this framework. Geopolitically, it's huge, largest country in Central Asia, right between Europe and Asia. A pivot state, that's key 1. And resources, obviously. Massive oil and gas reserves, that's key 3.
And key 2, the great power connection, is critical. Its location makes it vital for both China and Russia. The source calls it China's Western Gateway and Russia's Southern Gateway. Literally, they really hammer the point that Kazakhstan is indispensable for China's Belt and Road Initiative. Vital pipelines cross its territory, the oil pipeline, the big gas pipeline to China. So if you want to mess with that whole Eurasian connectivity project, hitting Kazakhstan makes a lot of strategic sense. Maximum disruption.
Right. So pulling it all together, the source claims the U.S. deep state's objective was basically regime change, to install a pro-American government that would act, and I think this is the direct quote from the source, like a dagger inserted between China and Russia.
Exactly that, a dagger. The idea, according to this analysis, was that this new regime would just constantly stir up trouble, create crises, systematically disrupt those crucial infrastructure links. The energy flows, the freight railways between China and Europe, basically create ongoing expensive headaches for both Moscow and Beijing at the same time. A strategy of, well, engineered instability.
Okay, but the plan, if it was a plan, didn't succeed. And this is where the narrative shifts in the source material to the response. The source really emphasizes how fast and coordinated the countermove was from regional powers. It suggests China and Russia immediately saw it the same way the source does, as an external threat.
Exceptionally fast, yes. The source details China's reaction quite specifically. President Xi sends a message to President Tokayev, and the language used is highlighted. Xi states a firm opposition to external forces running color revolutions. And crucially, pledges support to the best of our ability. The source points out this phrase is unusually strong in diplomatic terms. Not just, we'll help if we can, but a real proactive commitment.
And then the military side kicked in just as fast. Tokayev asks for help from the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Russian-led security bloc. And bam, within hours, Russian paratroopers and special forces are deploying, securing Almaty Airport, other key sites, helping the government regain control very, very quickly.
And the source gives a lot of credit for this swift success to President Tokayev himself, his decisiveness. They actually connect his background directly to his actions. It's quite interesting. They note he studied in Beijing at the language university, speaks fluent Chinese. He's described as having the sentiments of a scholar, but also, real-world diplomatic toughness.
Yeah, that background detail seems important to their argument. They mention he was actually a diplomat in Beijing back during the 1989 Tiananmen Square events.
Yeah.
And he also witnessed the Soviet Union collapse in '91.
Exactly. So the source argues, having seen the Soviet collapse up close, and maybe more importantly, having understood, quote, how Chinese statesmen forcefully responded to Western color revolutions. Tokayev had the political judgment, the experience to instantly recognize the alleged pattern, to see it as external meddling and not hesitate. He immediately called in the CSTO. His specific background in this analysis was the crucial factor that prevented a drawn-out crisis or even collapse.
So, wrapping up their analysis, the source draws this really direct comparison. They put the Kazakhstan events side by side with the Hong Kong protests from 2019. They stress the similarities in tactics, the alleged foreign agents, the NGO networks, the sophisticated social media use. Same playbook, they argue.
But the outcomes, totally different. That's the key distinction for the source. Hong Kong dragged on for ages.
Right.
A long political siege, intense media battles. Kazakhstan, though, resolved incredibly quickly, decisively. Over in just a few days, really.
So why did the alleged operation fail so quickly in Kazakhstan, according to this view? Was it just Tokayev being decisive?
That's part of it, definitely. But the source also offers a kind of strategic critique of the alleged plotters. They give credit to Russia, too. Putin's decisiveness, the speed of the CSTO intervention, even while, the Ukraine situation was brewing. They call Putin a world-class strategist. But they also suggest the U.S. and the West, or whoever was behind it, maybe acted too hastily in Kazakhstan. Rushed it.
Rushed it. How so? What's the theory there?
Well, the source posits that after the perceived failure or messy withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was this desperate need for a quick win in Central Asia. And this urgency led to basically a botched execution. That's the phrase they use.
Botched how?
Because they moved too fast to violence, to armed conflict. The source argues the classic color revolution playbook relies more on a long political game. Sustain protests, erode the government's legitimacy bit by bit, use media narratives. A siege, not an assault. By jumping straight to armed rioters, seizing buildings, they argue, the organizers showed their hand too early, made it military, not political. And that gave Tokayev the undeniable justification, the clear signal, to call for external military help like the CSTO. There was no ambiguity left.
Right. And that swift resolution then feeds into the source's concluding political point, a pretty strong rejection of what they call full westernization. They frame Western-style democracy essentially as a manipulative tool of super capitalists.
Yeah, and the counter-argument is that for stability in places like Central Asia, you actually need a strong, centralized government, a political core that can push back against external interference and prevent internal divisions from spiraling. That, for them, is the only way to guarantee stability. #outro. So if we try to boil this down for you, the listener, the main takeaway from this source's perspective is this. They argue forcefully that in strategically vital countries like Kazakhstan, things like an economic crisis, that gas price hikes often aren't the root cause, they're just the spark. A convenient spark that gets immediately exploited, they claim, to launch a much bigger, externally orchestrated play for regime change and control over resources.
And the way the region responded, China's diplomatic backing, Russia's quick military help via CSTO, underscores, for this source, the importance of regional security alliances like the SKO and CSTO. Their view is clear. The countries in that region prioritize stability above almost everything else, and they see Western interference as, well, deeply unwelcome and destabilizing. Unpopular is the word used.
Which leaves us with a pretty potent question for you to think about, building on this analysis. Considering how incredibly fast things escalated in Kazakhstan in 2022, from protest to alleged coup attempt in days, does this signal a future trend? In an era of rising geopolitical tension, will future crises in these strategic hotspots be stamped out faster because of rapid countermoves, or will they just become more violent more immediately right from the start?
That's definitely something to chew on. A complex picture indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the sources. We'll see you next time.